Well, I think the thing about the debt is it depended on how you educate. Because sometimes they didn't explain the things. Maybe
Okay. Well, thanks for showing up. A little bit of snow never hurt anybody. Just imagine, I looked up at Lamborn out our back window today and I thought, we had an old cowboy friend in Prescott and he'd say, Todd, how'd you like to be up there in nothing but a wet sheet and spurs? That would be chilly. You know, and I think of Lewis and Clark and all the weather they endured. And these guys were tough. And the young lady with them as well. And taking care of a baby on the whole deal.
And the dog too.
And the dog. The dog had his winter coat on him all the time, though. So, what's that? This was 1804 to 1806. 2 years, 4 months, 10 days. Remember, if you would again, turn those cell phones to silencio, por favor. Otherwise, they don't get ventilated. Which makes them run a lot cooler when they have a hole through the middle. Okay, we've got a lot to cover today. When we finished yesterday, Lewis has spent, a lot of time in Philadelphia, the spring and the summer in Philadelphia and in Harper's Ferry, picking up all these supplies. He's got $2,500 burning a hole in his pocket, and he's buying everything under the sun for this camping trip that he's going to undertake. And the one thing I forgot to mention, because I had it in my case there on my belt, was the compass that they carried. And they used a technique called dead reckoning. And that's not DEAD like dead, it's DED, which stands for deduction. And so that was the way, at the end of the day, the captains would query everybody in the group, how far did we go today? A lot of guys back then were trained in the art of surveying, so they could pace off a measured mile within a couple of feet. They were really good at it. And then at the end, they'd add it all up together, divided by the number of guys, come up with the final tally of miles for the day. Then the captains had the final word as to how many miles they ascertained they went that day. Out of the 4,162 miles from the mouth of the Missouri to the Pacific Ocean, they were off by just about 38 miles. That's pretty dang good without using a satellite GPS, and they were really, really accurate. I know people can't find their car in the parking lot after 2 hours. And, these guys were just, they just had this innate sense, when you spend that much time out in the wilderness. So I'm going to pass this around. It does have glass in it, and I made it quite a few years ago during the bicentennial, which was 2003 to 2006, where there was a whole Corps of Discovery 2, a reenactment group that went all the way from Virginia, starting in Monticello with Jefferson, and all the way to the Pacific and back, recreating the entire expedition to the day, camping in the spots they camped where possible, and meeting all the native tribes along the way, and doing all kinds of things. It was a really amazing event. I was up on the Columbian Snake doing cruises at that time, so we got to see the guys in their dugouts, and going down to the Pacific. And it was really funny because how many have you been to Fort Clatsop outside of Astoria? Fort Clatsop was, of course, their winter destination point. And in the winter of 2005, right to the day that Lewis and Clark would have shown up in 1805 in the fall, Fort Clatsop burned down. The recreation that was Fort Clatsop #2. And so now the Fort Clatsop you see now is Fort Clatsop #3. The original, then the first replica, it burned down in the fall of 2005, and now the new one stands and it's much better. And so we were there, and it was just a smoldering pile of logs. If you've ever been there, it was pretty devastating. And so I nicknamed it Fort Flat Spot because it just, and when the guys showed up, I said, well, this is appropriate. There's no fort here for you to snuggle into tonight. You're gonna have to, and it was a rainy, miserable winter. And they were like, yeah, we're going into town. We're staying at a hotel. So they didn't bother. But anyway, this compass during the bicentennial, a lot of people kind of joke and say, if you had a nose inhaler that said Lewis and Clark, and it was left-handed, glowed in the dark, you could sell them during the bicentennial. Anything that had Lewis and Clark on it, you could sell it. So a friend of mine and I, he's an instrument maker. We replicated Thomas Whitney's compass. The original with the case is in the Smithsonian. It endured the entire trip and was lost on the trip at Great Falls, Montana. York retrieved it in a mudslide a couple of days later. So this piece of this artifact, there's about 50 items from the trip they're authenticated to be actually on the trip and are now in museums around the country. And so I'm going to pass this around. So just make sure that when you pass it off, the person that's getting it next has got a good grip on it. Yeah, please. Okay, so Lewis, he's made all his connections in Philadelphia, Harper's Ferry, Washington, the federal city. He's done everything, and he's been writing letters because we haven't talked about William Clark too much because he's not on the scene yet. And I told you how many people were going to go on this trip originally? 15. Well, Lewis and Jefferson kept talking and going, what if something happens to you, Captain Lewis? Who's going to take the reins of this expedition? And he says, well, I think we should have a co-leader, a co-captain, which is not normal in military protocol to have two co-leaders. And so anyway, they decided that would be a good idea. And they also decided to ramp up the numbers, eventually getting up to almost 60. And so at this point, when Lewis is writing to some old Army buddies, he writes to two of them. One of them is Captain William Clark, who's been out of the Army for a while. And another one is Captain Moses Hook, H-O-O-K-E. And so when he doesn't hear from Clark, he writes to Captain Hook. And which I always thought maybe instead of Sacagawea, it would have been Tinkerbell had been on the trip or something. I don't know. But anyway, he writes, and he's not hearing from Clark because it's a very messy summer. Again, all the mail's being carried by horses and the roads are muddy and everything's taken too long. And so they're writing these letters, and finally, here is a letter that I paraphrased from, I just took a segment of it, from Lewis to Clark, written from Washington, June of 1803. Clark, thus, my friend, you have a summary of the plan, the means, and the objects of this expedition. If therefore there is anything under these circumstances in this enterprise which would induce you to participate with me in its fatigues, its dangers, and honors. You got to remember that, fatigues, dangers, and honors. He says, believe me, there is no man on earth with whom I should feel equal pleasure in sharing them as with yourself. So it's a personal entreaty to please join me on this expedition. They go way back in the military. They know each other. They're a very good balance of leadership. Finally, Lewis has written a letter and he's waiting to hear whoever writes me back, whether it's Hook or Hook, or Clark or Hook, I'm gonna take the one that writes back first. Well, luckily for us, I don't know much about Moses Hook. Nobody knows too much about him, but Clark finally writes back a month later. Lewis, I received by yesterday's mail your letter the 19th of June. The enterprise, etc., is such, and you'll find out that when William Clark writes letters, if you read his journals, there's a lot of etc., 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 and then ... etc. When you read a journal entry from Lewis, if things are going south and not working out real well, he's always mortified. That was kind of their catchphrase of the day. Today, what would he say? Whatever. But back then it was mortified. And so you can always tell by the quote, if it says etc. 3 times in a row, it's William Clark. So I said, your letter the 19th, the enterprise, etc., 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 is such as I have long anticipated and I am much pleased with. I will cheerfully join you, as mentioned in your letter, and partake, again, the dangers, difficulties, and fatigues of this expedition. I also anticipate the honors and rewards of this undertaking, should we be successful in accomplishing it. So he knows that if they pull it off, there's going to be some monetary reward. There's going to be land grants, maybe a gig with Oprah, maybe a Tom Hanks movie, something like that. So finally, the union of Lewis and Clark is finally cemented with these letters, and they write back and forth some more, because now Lewis writes to Clark and says, I need you to recruit some strong, young, unmarried men used to hardship to join us on this expedition. Those are known as the 9 young men from Kentucky. Okay, so while Clark is doing that and getting those men together, Lewis is also written to a boat builder. Here's the state of Pennsylvania right here, Pittsburgh down in this corner. Below Pittsburgh, there's the Monongahela and the Allegheny rivers come together to form the Ohio, one of the biggest rivers in the US, almost 1,000 miles long, number 2 by volume. It's a big river. And so he writes to a boat builder in Elizabeth, Pennsylvania to build him a 50-foot long barge. So 50 foot is from about the front of this building to out here and 8 feet wide, and it's going to draw about 4.5 feet. It's going to be able to carry about 20,000 pounds of equipment. So Lewis sends off his plans and he writes to this boat builder, please get this underway. I'm going to be there by late June, early July, and we're going to push off. So he's getting all of his things that he's purchased with that 2,500 bucks is all being transported to Pittsburgh to a rendezvous point to load on the boat and down the Ohio. Clark is still in a place called Clarksville, Indiana. Anybody been to Clarksville? Louisville, Kentucky, and they're right across the river from each other. And so that's where the Clark family is. That's why it's called Clarksville. That's how they settled there early on. Born in Virginia, but moved out to Clarksville. So Clark is going to be working his way, around here in the Kentucky, Ohio, and this area here, looking for those 9 young men. And Lewis, he's waiting for all of his things to come to Pittsburgh. The boat is taking a very long time to be built, a really long time. Lewis shows up at the boatyard, and he shows up at like 11 o'clock in the morning, and the boat builder is dead drunk, passed out on the ground, wood shavings. The keel is laid, the ribs are up. There's no planking on it. Lewis is mortified. And so Lewis says, I love some of these quotes. I've made some little notebooks that have some of these quotes just because they're so well said. He says, my late departure on the trip was due to the unpardonable negligence and the inattention of the boat builders who were incorrigible drunkards. Neither threats nor entreaties of any other treatment I could devise had any effect upon them to hasten my project's end. So he was not happy. So he goes into Pittsburgh to seek some relief, and he purchases some affection. Now, it's not what you think. It's not a female. It's a dog. And then so he buys this big 150-pound or so big Newfoundland dog named Seaman, S-E-A-M-A-N. Now, the reason he names him that is because these dogs from Newfoundland are trained to be a surf rescue dog. If you're not familiar with Newfies, they look like a St. Bernard, similar kind of body. They have webbed paws, so they're very powerful swimmers, big powerful tail like a sweeping rudder, and they were trained to jump out into the surf when a ship went down. All you had to do is grab onto that long coat, and that dog would instinctively turn to shore and pull you back to shore. So he names them Seaman because these dogs were trained for surf and sea rescue. So this dog will endure the entire trip, and we'll talk about him a little bit more. So Lewis gets the dog, pays about, is it $25, $30, which today would be about $200-300 bucks. He pays for this dog. And Laura Lee right here, a lot of you know her. She wrote a book, Bound for the Western Sea, the canine version of the Lewis and Clark expedition, the canine account of the Lewis and Clark expedition. It's a great read because it's not only historically very accurate about the expedition, but also it brings in, Lewis writes of his dog, he said, my dog is most sagacious. Now, sagacious is not a term that we use too much today. It's kind of fallen out of use, but it means keen, alert, attentive. So there's scenes in the book where they get to a camp and the dog's like, this is not a good place to camp. And the captain's like, no, this is great. This is fine. We got trees, we got firewood, we got wood. And the dog's going, don't you guys smell that? This is bad juju here. So the dog has got a kind of an inner track on some of the things. And it's a really delightful book, and it's a great read on Lewis and Clark as well. So, Alexa, thank you. So anyway, Lewis, finally, he wants to leave by, late June, early July, because what do rivers do in the late summer, early fall? They drop. So his boat finally gets done. All the supplies come. It is the end of August. The river has dropped considerably. Lewis gets all this tonnage of equipment into the boat, casts off his lines. They go to push off from the dock. Okay, everybody, on 3, 1, 2. They are firmly aground. The river has dropped so much, Lewis is mortified. So all this stuff that he has put and packed together, Lewis has got the clipboard, he's got all these supplies categorized, all loaded in the boat, just so. And now he's got to change that. He's got to lighten his load. So he buys 2 used boats. Now, what do used wooden boats all have in common? They leak. So he buys these Tuperos, a red one and a white one, and they can carry about 8,000 pounds each. So now all this carefully packed equipment has to be offloaded, put in these Tuperos that are leaking, and now things are getting wet, things are starting to rust and mildew. Lewis was indeed mortified. So down the river they go, and this is one of the best scenes from Laura Lee's book and from the journals, where this big dog, Seaman, they're going down the Ohio, and Lewis witnesses something he can't explain. And it is a massive movement going across the Ohio River. And it was a mass migration of squirrels swimming across the river. And he's like, well, that's strange. So Lewis is wondering, well, why are they going from right to left and not left to right? The old days back then, they said that the forest canopy was so big, if you were a squirrel, you could go all the way across the Alleghenies without touching ground, if you were a squirrel. And so the dog is going crazy. He can smell it, he can see it, all this activity thrashing in the water. They said, well, go on, boy. And the dog jumps off and grabs a bunch of squirrels, swims right back, brings them, kills them, jumps them. And they had squirrel, they dined on squirrel that night. So the dog already, early on in the trip, has already shown his value on the expedition. And they'll have lots of other incidents like that throughout the course of the trip. So down the Ohio they go. They have a lot of fog, sandbars. This boat draws 4.5 feet. They hit places where the river's only 2 feet deep. They had to take their oars. They had to dig out the sand, rock the boat through. Remember, this is a 50-foot vessel. This is like trying to push one of those big diesel pusher motorhomes through the mud when it's stuck off-road. This is really hard to do. So he ends up hiring farmers with oxen to hook up to the vessel and pull it and drag it. And it's just a backbreaking work. So they finally get down to right here to the falls of the Ohio at the Louisville, right here, Louisville and Clarksville section of the country. And this is where they will finally meet, where the captains will finally shake hands and join forces. Clark has done his recruiting for all these 9 young men from Kentucky. He also adds 1 more man to the expedition. And who might that be? It's a personal friend of his slave, York. York had been given to William Clark by his parents. His parents owned York's parents. Old York and Rose were the parents of York. And York was given to William Clark when he was probably 5 years old as a childhood companion and a manservant, basically. So they grew up together, had a long history together, and he was his personal servant. So now York is on the trip. So now we've got the big Newfoundland, we've got a slave on board, a servant, and we've got these 9 young men from Kentucky. How many of you have been to Jackson Hole and Grand Teton? What was it called before it was known as Jackson Hole and the Grand Teton? It was called Coulter's Hill. That's my son. He grew up with these stories. And so John Coulter was one of the 9 young men from Kentucky. And when the Lewis and Clark expedition came back, he opted out. He said, I don't want to go back to St. Louis. He stayed out west and became the first American mountain man and discovered going up the Shoshone River into Cody, Wyoming from the east and entering what is now Grand Teton National Park and Yellowstone National Park. He discovered that, and that's why they called it Coulter's Hill, because of all the boiling sulfur pots there in the Yellowstone area along the Firehole River and all that. So that's a little bit about John Coulter. We'll talk about him a little later. So they finally get down here. They stay about 2 weeks at the confluence there at Louisville, Kentucky. And then they push on down the river. William Clark's phrase in his journal is, we proceeded on. Every day we proceeded on. So down the river they continue. Along the way, they're recruiting every little fort they stop at. They're culling out. They're saying, okay, we got these two. Okay, I don't like the way that guy's been acting on the trip so far. You're out, you two are in. So they're constantly culling their group to get the very best skill set people they could get on this trip. And so one of them down here at Fort Massac was a very interesting guy. His father was French. His mother was Shawnee. And his name, anybody know his name? He's mentioned over 500 times in the journals.
I'm not going to answer all the questions.
He's named over 500 times in the journals. Now, you either get named 500 times because you're really good, or you're really stupid. You know, I mean, there's lots of guys that don't get mentioned hardly at all because all they do is cut firewood and dig latrines. But George Drouillard, he was half French, half Shawnee, and they hire him as a civilian, and he is going to be probably their finest hunter. There's a couple other guys that are pretty good hunters too, but George Drouillard is going to be, William Clark writes of him, he could track a shadow through a rainstorm at night. That's pretty good tracking skill. And so they hired George Drouillard, and I always say he was 1/3 French. How can you be 1/3? 1/3 French, 1/3 Shawnee, and 1/3 animal. This guy, he just had that sixth sense, hunter, predator, you know, and probably the kind of guy that you'd meet, you know, at a bar or something and go, whoa, he's got stories. You know, don't want to get on the bad side of that guy. He was also kind of a bounty hunter too after the expedition. He was kind of a harsh character, but he always got them meat, so that was good for the expedition. Then they get down here to the confluence of the Ohio and the Mississippi. Now they got to go up here to St. Louis. They got to go upstream. Well, let's see, you got a 55-foot boat, and it weighs about 26,000 pounds, 2 pirogues. So how are you going to do it? There's 4 ways to move that vessel upstream. Number 1 was it had 11 sets of oars on each side. So all the men would row in concert, you know, stroke, 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 row the boat up the stream. They also had a 30-foot mast with a square sail. So if the wind was favorable, they could sail upstream, which happens sometimes. Then they also had poling. These were big, long setting poles. And the deck was cleated, so they would just put the pole over the side and they would walk from bow to stern. And as they pushed the pole on the bottom, it would propel the vessel forward. The 4th method was the one they hated the most. It was called the cordel, a big, heavy line coming off the bow of the boat. So as most everybody over the side, shoulder that rope over your shoulder, and you just start walking. And of course, 4.5 feet is what the boat needs to float. So as the river meanders like this, you're staying in the outside curves. That's where the deepest water is, right? That's also where the strongest current is. It's also where the cut banks are, where things tend to cave into the river and crush you and bury you in dirt and logs and that type of thing. So they hired a lot of Frenchmen along the way, the French couriers, these boatmen who were well known for their canoeing and paddling skills. So they had a little ditty they sang about them. They said, they are Frenchmen, born and bred, strong in the arm, weak in the head. And so they hired them just for their brawn, not for their brains. So these guys made about 10 miles a day, going upriver, because the Mississippi has about a steady 5-mile-an-hour current. And that doesn't sound like very fast today in our very fast-paced world. But I know there's plenty of folks in here who have done river trips. If you've ever missed a takeout at the end of a river trip and gone, whoop, there it is. I did that once on the San Juan River with my brother. We went about a 1/4 mile past it because the willows were all overgrown, and we had to walk back a 1/4 mile, dragging our 18-foot boat up about an 8-mile-an-hour current. Took us 4 hours, and we were exhausted just grabbing willows and pulling ourselves and dragging this boat. So until you've had to do that, you never want to do that twice. Everybody can screw up once, but you try not to do it twice. So now they're pushing, pulling, rowing their way up the river. And now here at Fort Kaskaskia, they pick up another individual. His name is going to be John Ordway. He's going to be one of the most consistent journal keeper. The captains nicknamed him Steady John because he writes a journal entry every single day. Now, Lewis has a lot of big gaps in his journals. Other men, weren't as punctual, but John Ordway, he wrote something every single day. Now, granted, at Fort Clatsop, when it was raining, he said, rain today, overcast, cold, gloomy, miserable, wet, hated. And then the next day he wrote rained again as usual. And the next 10 entries are just ditto, 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 ditto. Oh, rained again, rained again, rained again. So John Ordway will be in charge of the expedition when the captains are both gone and all the men are, together. So they work their way up to St. Louis. They will spend, St. Louis is a frontier town about the size of Paonia, about 1,500 people at this time. And the captain said, you know what? There's too many bars. There's too many Spanish women and French women here. This is not going to be a good place to have these young recruits. So they would camp across the river in Illinois territory, a place called Camp Wood on the Wood River. So that's where William Clark will spend most of the winter of 1803, 1804, right here in the Illinois territory with the men, while Captain Lewis spends most of his time in St. Louis buying and procuring more things because the expedition was growing. And so once you get more people, you need more bedding, more pots and pans, more plates, more spoons, more flour, more, it just exponentially builds. So they spend the entire winter there mustering this group into a crack military outfit. Now that's exactly what Jefferson wanted. This wasn't just a bunch of guys going on a 2-year camping trip. This was to be a very expertly led military discipline expedition. And we'll talk about a couple of things when we get here to mile 0 on the Missouri. But William Clark does that. They have shooting practice and they have all kinds of things. They have competitions with the local farmers to turkey shoots to see who's going to win the prize and be the best shot. And William Clark does very well with that. William Clark was in artillery. That's why he has the 1 gold epaulet. You can see in this picture, 1 gold epaulet meant you were a captain in the artillery. Lewis has a silver epaulet. That's a rifleman, a sniper, crack shot. So the spring of 1804 rolls around, May 14th to be exact. Clark brings all his men. They cross the river, across the Mississippi to the mile 0, the mouth of the Missouri right here. And they reunite there. And then they start their way up the river, up the Missouri River on May the 14th, 1804. They stop their first night in a little place called St. Charles. Anybody been to St. Charles? It's a cool little river town, and they've got replicas of all the boats that were built there for the bicentennial. And a very quaint little town. The little log church is still there where they all went to mass, those that were so desirous of doing that. And then the next little town that they went around was only a little tiny town called La Charette, a little French settlement of only about 10 families. And when they got there, they gave them milk and eggs and butter and spoke with them and wished them well. And as they pulled and rowed their boats from mile 0 going upstream on the Missouri, they went around a bend in the river. And the last thing they did was they tipped their hat and bid adieu to the dairy cow that they passed that was left behind. And they knew that's the end of white civilization as we know it for probably a good long time. And they were right. So now this is May the 14th, 1804. They're working their way up the river. Now, they're not just going up the river to look for, this fabled Northwest Passage, this water route over, the mountains to the Pacific. That was the main driver for this whole expedition. There was also lots of other things. Jefferson wanted all the people that they met, all the indigenous groups, record their languages, their customs, the way they just do things, how they live, how they hunt, how their women give birth to babies, what's their educational process, all these things. He said, I also want you to cover the geology. Remember yesterday I said, Lewis, he found some white powder, a layer of white powder in the rocks, and he took a dollop of that and put it in his mouth. It was arsenic, naturally occurring arsenic, almost killed him. They found fossils. They found all kinds of things. So Jefferson, you might not know this, but he was our nation's first paleontologist. They called him, he was the bone collector is the term that his friends gave him, because he was very much into prehistoric bones. If you've ever been to Big Boone Lick in Kentucky, anybody been there? Look at the hands go up all over the room. Yeah, it's not it's a little state park in Kentucky, but it's a salt lick. It's kind of like La Brea tar pits in California. Same kind of thing. Animals went there in La Brea, they got stuck in the tar. Here, they even got mired down in the salt and they got preserved. And so those things were known, but Jefferson was very keen on getting these fossils and collecting them. He had a very eclectic band of interest. And what's interesting to note, you got to read a lot of Lewis and Clark to come up with some of these obscure things, but in the French Alps, a mammoth had recently been discovered back in the early 1800s. And Jefferson was a Francophile, right? He was ambassador over there for 5 years, loved everything French. So when he heard that in the old world in France, in Europe, this mammoth had been found frozen, he said, well, that's the old world. This is the new world. There's a lot of country out here. I bet you there's still some of those mammoths kind of walking around. So he says to Lewis, if you find one, bring it on home. Now I know that might be difficult, so maybe just bring me a baby. Can you just see Lewis with his checklist going, got it, Mastodon, not happening. And so that was one thing on the list. The other thing was a lake of whiskey. Well, that doesn't exist. Last time I heard, that was just east of the Big Rock Candy Mountain, surrounded by the forest of cigarette trees. So that didn't exist. The other one was a massive lake of salt. Now, I have been there. I'm sure some of you have too. And a glass mountain. That's in Yellowstone National Park, Obsidian Mountain, just a big sheet of obsidian natural glass rock. And what's the other one was a tribe of blonde-haired, blue-eyed Welsh Indians. Kind of like Leif Erikson types, but these were Welsh Indians that were supposed to be up in this area here, around present-day Mandans and Standing Rock Reservation. And then the last one, he said, if you be on the lookout for the lost tribes of Israel. They might be wandering around out there as well. And so they had quite a punch list. In addition to all the topography, river confluences, types of trees, soil types, arable soil, rocks, minerals, you name it. This was just an amazing list of stuff that Jefferson wanted. So up the river they go, and every time they meet with a group of Indians, one of the big ones was at Council Bluffs. And here, of course, all the men come out in their military finery. They hand out the peace medals and the letters of loyalty. They hand out trade beads to the chiefs and everything, and just kind of shout, give them little American flags along with the peace medals. And then they said, we're wanting you all to make peace because this river is a trade route. We want to have this river as a viable, navigable, commercial water route to the Pacific and on to the Orient. Well, if you've got all these tribes that are all at each other's throats, it's kind of hard to have business going on. So the whole thing was to have all these tribes sign these peace treaties, which they did. Of course, the Indians are looking at this going, what is this? They had no clue. And they said, and who is this guy here? Oh, that's the new Great White Father. Well, they said, well, what about this guy, King George? And they go, and they pull that medal off and go, new guy. This is now part of the United States. And the chief said, we didn't get that memo. We didn't hear about that. So at this point, there's a lot of conflict. Lewis and Clark were extremely naive when it came to these peace treaties. They just thought, and I just read a great quote by Harry Truman. It says, the only new thing in the world that you don't know is the history you haven't read. Ties right in with history repeats itself, right? And those who fail to read it are bound to repeat it. And so Lewis and Clark, they just thought, yeah, we'll just go in here, we'll sign this off, put your name in the blank, give you the peace medal, we're all good, everything cool, good, okay, you're all gonna be friends now. They've been at each other's throats for 1,000 years. So it was kind of a very naive approach there. So they get up here, and after they have their meeting here, they get up, they keep working their way up. They get up here to present-day Sioux City, Iowa, and one of their sergeants, Sergeant Charles Floyd, he's not feeling well. It's about the 18th, 19th of August, only 4 months into the expedition. And Sergeant Floyd is just like, he's in a lot of abdominal pain. So they stop early for the day, and Lewis administers some of Dr. Rush's restorative purgatives. Sets him to retching and severe diarrhea. Says, how you feeling now? And he goes, a whole lot worse. So he doses him again. When that has no seeming effect, then he bleeds him. And so they stay up for 2 nights with him. Clark's up with him all night. Lewis is up with him because Lewis is the doctor, right? And York stays up with him all night, putting hot claws on his head, trying to do anything they can do to relieve him. But the medical practice of the day that Lewis was exerting on this poor guy probably hastened his death, because there was nothing they could have done to alleviate his abdominal severe pain, because he had a burst appendix. And it would be another 85 years before appendectomies would be even thought about and be successfully operated on. So Sergeant Floyd would have died had he been back in Philadelphia, at the finest medical facility, the Mayo Clinic of Philly back in 1803, he would have died. There was nothing they could do. So Sergeant Floyd calls to William Clark, and he calls him over, and he knows he's not doing well. And he says, Captain, would you write for me a letter? I fear I'm going away today. And so William Clark, as it's dictated, he writes a letter. Dear parents, I will not have the pleasure of seeing you again in this lifetime. No, I love you. See you on the other side. Your loving son, Charles Floyd. And he died with a great deal of composure at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and he just slipped away. And so that will be the first and the only death on the expedition. That in itself is amazing. There's been no other expedition in US history, and in other history, once on the boat, we had a whole group that chartered the boat from Australia. So I was trying to find out, was there a Lewis and Clark counterpart in Australia? And there was. It was called Wilkes and Booth, or Wilkes and Booth, I think it was. And they were going from, if you look at Australia, they were doing the East Coast. The Snowy Mountains are their continental divide that are very close to the East Coast. And they're trying to string a telegraph line. It was in 1860s. Whoever could survey the route and string the line first made the big prize money. One guy survived out of 60. One guy. Everybody else died. Starvation, dehydration, crocs, everything. The saltwater crocs killed them all. So Lewis and Clark to only lose one in 2 years, 4 months, and 10 days, unheard of, especially back then with the very harsh medical practices they were experimenting with. So they bury Sergeant Floyd here, and it's interesting to note that Floyd's monument, it sits outside of Sioux City, Iowa. It's about a 100-foot tall sandstone obelisk. It is our nation's first National Historic Registered Monument, 1906. Number one, you see those oval plaques, National Historic Site, Monument. Well, Sergeant Floyd, first one. So he's there at Sioux City, Iowa, and his grave was there. His grave's been moved like 3 times because the river keeps cutting into the bank there. And once it washed his grave out, and locals went out and collected his skull and bones and brought him back and buried him again. They buried him 3 times because the river was, just always cutting away at the bank there. So they bury Sergeant Floyd here. And now the problem is they're down by 1 sergeant. They have 3 squads, but now they only have 2 sergeants. So if you're in the military, what's going to happen? Promote from within. You're going to promote from within. And so you would think the captain would just say, you're going to be our next sergeant. Because they've got a pretty cohesive group here. But the captains don't do that. The captains say, men, who do you think should be the next sergeant? And the men all went, oh, well, this is different. You mean you want us to weigh in on that? And they said, absolutely. You all work together, you're living together. Who do you think? And they said, well, we think it should be Private Patrick Gass. That journal I showed you yesterday, that's Patrick Gass, that was his journal. And so Patrick Gass becomes the new sergeant. And this guy's amazing. William Clark writes 2 things about him. He says, his language is more suited for around the campfire than the parlor. And he never drinks water. He's Scots-Irish. He's a hard-drinking, hard-talking, and he's a carpenter. The guy can make anything. He is the expedition carpenter. He will build the 3 forts. Camp Dubois on the Wood River. He will build Fort Mandan up in North Dakota, and he will build Fort Clatsop. And he will build other means of conveyance, wagons and carts. He'll build furniture. He'll fix anything in wood. So pretty amazing. So Patrick Gass becomes the new sergeant and commences to writing and keeping a very good journal, which I showed you one of the original ones yesterday. So they're working their way up after Patrick Gass. They get right up here on the Nebraska-South Dakota border, a little town there called Lynch, Nebraska. Anybody been to Lynch? In all the years I've done this, I've had 1 person on a cruise said, they raised their hand, and I said, "You've been to Lynch?" And he goes, "Yep." And I said, "What were you doing in Lynch?" And he goes, "Live there." I said, "I'm sorry." Lynch is a pretty rough little spot, but it was here at this spot that Lewis and Clark got up on this mound, and they saw this tremendous village of little animals. And these little animals kept popping their heads up. And Lewis nicknamed them barking squirrels. And they were prairie dogs, little black-tailed prairie dogs. And so they decided to catch one. Well, have you ever tried to catch a prairie dog? So they'd go over to it, and they would go down this hole, disappear, and show up over there. And then they'd start digging over there, and they would show up over here. And then they'd come up over here, and they'd end up over there. So pretty, these prairie dogs are just all over the place. There you go, now there's a throw. Oh, you killed him. So they're getting really frustrated. This is kind of the Laurel and Hardy moment on the Lewis and Clark expedition. They start digging holes, dirt flying everywhere, and these prairie dogs are just, all over the place. They finally managed to flush one out by dumping 5 barrels of water. And this prairie dog comes up, and he's half drowned, and they grabbed him and they put him in a cage. The rest that drowned and died, they ate for dinner. But that little prairie dog will survive the expedition, and we'll talk about him with the fate of the Corps too, because he survived the whole expedition, wintered over at Fort Mandan, made it all the way back down to St. Louis, all the way down to New Orleans, around the tip of Florida, and up to the president's office in Monticello. So, the prairie dog traveled more miles than Lewis and Clark did. And we'll talk about his story a little bit later. So it goes from, funny, pranks here catching this prairie dog to right up here called Confrontation or Bad River. Here's where they finally meet the Teton Sioux. These are the bad boys of the plains. These were the gangsters of the plains. And Jefferson knew about the Teton Sioux, and he told the captains, treat them with kid gloves. They are a powerful, formidable people, very large group. We need to have their cooperation to have the river open for commercial traffic. We gotta, treat them really, really well. So long story short, they get up there, and this Teton Sioux chief, his name is Black Buffalo. He's standing on the side of the river, and he goes, stop. Put their boats into the shore, and they're talking George Drouillard. Another reason they hired him, not only was he a really good hunter, but he spoke French, he spoke Shawnee, and he was gifted in the fine art of hand gesticulation, sign language, sign talker. So George Drouillard is facilitating this translation with the chiefs there, and the chiefs are, they give them their paltry little, twisted tobacco, a piece metal. Here's some beads for the little woman. Very condescending, very naive, and they said that's not enough. Well, so they gave him some more. And then they gave him some whiskey. They said, it's not enough. They said, well, what do you want? And they said, the boat and everything in it. Now, we've all been on a toll road. We all paid the toll. Barrier goes up and down the road you go. But how many of you have been on a toll road and they said, out of the car, keys, please? That's a little extreme. And so the captain said no. Well, one of the sub-chiefs had a hold of one of the bros, and he was not going to let go. So William Clark pulls out his saber, his artillery saber, and he says, let go of my boat or I'm taking your hand off with the rope. And so when that happens, tensions are really going kind of high here. And Black Buffalo is watching all this. Now, what has happened just prior to this was Lewis has demonstrated his repeating air rifle with a lot of accuracy. But Black Buffalo, he's looking at this situation. He looks at all his warriors on both sides of the river. He raises his hands. Arrows are drawn and knocked. Lances are raised. Old muskets are primed and ready to go. And all his warriors are ready to just, Lewis and Clark are outnumbered 200-1. Could have wiped them out like that. But then Black Buffalo looked around and he thought, that gun of his, if they all have one of those, and he couldn't tell, he said, I'm going to lose a lot of my best warriors today. Today's not a good day to die. So it's just this flashpoint moment where you're just waiting for somebody to step on a twig, snap it, and somebody hit the trigger and start a whole war. Black Buffalo looks around, he puts his hands down. All the Indian weaponry comes down, the captains ease off, and Black Buffalo walks up to William Clark and goes, hey, I was just kidding, man. You seem like pretty nice guys. And so, but they had embarrassed him. And so they spent the night there, but then they got word that Black Buffalo and his troops were going to descend on Lewis and Clark and kill them. So they scurried out of there under cover of darkness and left that tense, that bad Confrontation River behind. And so we'll talk about them a little later. So up the river they go with the Teton Sioux behind them. It is now getting to be mid-October. How many have been in North Dakota in mid-October? Starting to get nippy. And I think the record recorded low in the area around Mandan, North Dakota was back in the early 1907 or something. It's like 69 degrees below zero. Actual temperature, that's not chill factor, feels like, that's actual mercury. Lewis and Clark recorded like almost 40 degrees below zero at Fort Mandan. That is chilly. When William Clark says, I'm writing in my journal, the ink freezes in my quill as I write. He's inside a shelter and its ink is freezing as he writes. So that's, I don't know, this weather here, this is balmy. I'm expecting to see oranges blooming anytime now. So anyway, they get up here into North Dakota, and here they will build their second fort, Fort Mandan, named after the Indians who live there. This is a group of about 5,000 people. And it is here, they live in earthen lodges that are, logs all stacked around and then mud, kind of adobe looking, and a big central hole in the top for a fireplace. And it's so cold in the winter that they bring all their livestock in with them. These are semi-nomadic. They are hunters, but they are also farmers. So they grow corn and beans and squash, but they also hunt the bison on the plains. So Lewis and Clark built this fort, which has nowhere near the insulative qualities of these Mandan earthen lodges. It is so cold, they commute the men's watches at the fort to 15 minutes per watch. 15 minutes, because otherwise they would have died of frostbite. And some of the men did suffer from frostbite on their extremities. So it was not a fun winter. So it is here at this site at Fort Mandan, which is south of Bismarck, present-day Bismarck, that they will hire Toussaint Charbonneau. He's about late 30s, early 40s, don't really know for sure. He's from Quebec, he's French-Canadian, and he's got a wife. Actually, he has two, but we'll only talk about one, because it's the one you all know about. And given the bulk of this age group, you all know her as Sacagawea. During the bicentennial event in 2004, they wanted to make sure they got it right. So they contacted the Shoshones. Unfortunately, they talked to two different groups of Shoshones, the northern and the southern Shoshones that don't agree on much of anything. And so they said, we want to get this right. So they came up with a proper pronunciation that most people agreed on, and that was Sacagawea. Not Sacagawea, but you can call her whatever you like. The captains did, the men in the journals did, because it was so hard to spell, and Hooked on Phonics worked for William Clark. He was a phonetic speller, and William Clark had one of his favorite quotes that I like to use. He says, I never trusted a man that could only spell a word one way. And we'll pass this one around here. Here's all the different spellings of Sacagawea, Sacagawea, Sakakawea, Sacagawea, all the different ways her names were spelled and from the journals on through history. So 14 different ways. So finally they said, you know what? Let's just call her Janie. J-A-N-E-Y. Everybody can say it, everybody can spell it. So she became known as Janie. She spoke no English, limited French. And so all the stories you've read about her, the 1,000-page Annalee Waldo Sacagawea is not even close to being historically accurate. It's a big, fleshed out novel full of lust and intrigue. And so it's not even close. So don't even, when people say, I read this big book on Sacagawea, I go, never mind. It's not accurate, not one bit, other than the names, which they didn't even change to protect the innocent, okay? So she is, she's up here, she is the property of Charbonneau. To say she's the wife, she's not going, hey, look what he got me. No, it's not that kind of arrangement. We don't know if he bought her, traded for her, won her in a horse race, gambling. We don't know. She's about 14, 15. He's in his late 30s, and they're an item. So they spend the winter through Fort Mandan, and in the spring or the late winter of 1805, February 11th, Sacagawea is ready to give birth to her baby. And at this stage of the game, she and her husband are living in the fort with the captains. Who's the doctor? Who got trained? Lewis. How many babies has Lewis delivered? 0. So what does he do first? Get to some of Dr. Rush's restorative purgatives. That'll set her up, because she said her labor was long, hard, and tedious, lasting over 2 days. So when that didn't work, he decided he would do a little bloodletting, see if that doesn't hasten the baby along. And Sacagawea is about ready. Well, they don't even know her name yet. They just call her Charbonneau's woman, the Indian girl. She doesn't have a name yet. And so that they know of, and she's just kind of there. And so Louis he doesn't know what to do. So there's another interpreter there. His name is Rene Gisson, and his wife is Mandan. And she whispers something to him. He translates it. He whispers it to Drouillard. Drouillard tells Clark. Clark and Louis confirm, and they say, okay, we'll try it. And what this Mandan woman said was, do you happen to have a rattlesnake rattle? And Louis says, I do. Because just a few weeks earlier, climbing up the banks of the Missouri River, there's a rattlesnake right there, and he reached up to grab a rock to pull himself up out of a ravine, and he almost got whacked in the hand. So what do? He pulls out his knife, cut off the head of the rattlesnake, cut off the tail, and saved it. You know, that's what you do with rattlesnakes, right? You keep the tail. So he had it. And so they had a whole medical kit. So she said, grind that up and make it into a powder, and then boil some water, make it tea, and feed the woman the tea. So that's what they do. She has rattlesnake tail powdered tea. And Louis says within 10 minutes, she delivered a fine boy. Now, how many of you think it was coincidental? She'd been in labor almost 3 days. How many of you think it really worked? How many of you nobody's hands are going up. You're just too chicken to raise your hand. You think I'm going to get you up here, right? No, I won't. That comes later. How many of you think this really worked? How many of you think it didn't? Huh?
Obviously it worked.
Well, obviously, or else it was just coincidental, right? Well, here's the interesting thing. There's a doctor. She's up on the Standing Rock Reservation. Her name is Dr. Monica Meyer. She is half Mandan, Mandan mother, German father. She's a medical doctor. She's also a native healer. So her practice up there is called old medicine, because she practices new and old, traditional Mandan healing and modern medicine. And so she's curious about this. Being a woman and a GP and delivering babies across the reservation, in her career, she says to her husband, "Give me a rattlesnake rattle," which he did. She ground it up, put it in solution, sent it off to a lab. She gets the report back, and she's fascinated. She says, this has the same qualities as Pitocin. Yeah, so ladies, the men are always go, huh? Sounds like a snack chip, But no, Pitocin, it's used to induce labor. And so did it really work? Absolutely. How the native population came up with rattlesnake tail will do that? Trial and error, I guess. So anyway, she has the baby. So what's the next thing you're going to ask? What's the baby's name? So they name him Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, after his paternal grandfather, whom he will never meet. So now we got this newest member of the expedition, newborn on February 11th, and on April the 7th, that little baby in his mother's arms will leave Fort Mandan and start working their way to the Pacific Ocean. Where is that? There it is. I don't know how it can be so wet and snowy and so dry at the same time. No, I'm from Arizona. We were just talking, driving down here. We go home to Arizona when we used to come up here to visit. And we didn't use half the lotion down there we used up here. I don't know, it's strange. So anyway, when the baby's not even a full 2 months old, and the expedition leaves Fort Mandan. Now, I told you it's been up to 60 people at this stage of the game. But what's going to happen is now the keel boat is too big to go farther up the Missouri River. It just draws too much. It's just too cumbersome. So the keel boat is going to go no further. This is the turnaround point for the keel boat, is Fort Mandan. So what they do is they collect all the things that they've gotten from their expedition so far, all their journals, the skeletons, the pelts, the botanical samples, all this stuff gets put on the keel boat and the prairie dog and a couple of magpies and a sage grouse. The birds didn't make it, but birds are always hard to keep alive. Mammals are a little easier. And so Lieutenant Worthington and the rest of the men, they worked their way all the way down to St. Louis. Then they worked their way all the way down to New Orleans. And Lewis has written expert directions on the care and feeding of the prairie dog and the magpies. And people are paid like $5 to keep this thing alive for like 2 months, 3 months. This guy goes down to the warehouse and and prairie dogs go into a torpid state, in the winter. They don't hibernate, but they kind of hunker down for the winter. And so this old prairie dog, by the time he gets down here to St. Louis, it is like August of 1805. And by the time he gets up here to Washington, the federal city, he is presented to Thomas Jefferson, and he's in a little cage. By now he's tame. You can hand feed him. Jefferson peels him an apple, and the little guy sits up on his desk, and he says the president was very pleased with this little fellow. And so it was a really well-traveled prairie dog. And then he gave him to Charles Wilson Peale, who had a museum. Who was a lot of the paintings you see in the National Gallery of Art were done by Thomas Peale of the early presidents, and his son Rembrandt Peale did a lot of those paintings. And so that little prairie dog will tell you what happens to him. He ends up in the circus. And so with P.T. Barnum. I mean, this stuff gets crazy. I can't make this stuff up. So anyway, when the return party, as they're known, head down the river with the barge and all these supplies, people always want to know, well, what happened when they got to the Teton Sioux? They blew them off on the way up there. Well, Clark says, well, when you're going down the river, you've got the current at your back. So you set your backs to those oars and you row hard and fast. You do not stop. And so here comes the Corps of Discovery, the return party coming down the river. Here's Black Buffalo going, stop. Yes, you. Yeah, stop. Hey, no, stop. And they didn't stop. They just went right on by and said, see ya. And they didn't stop. They didn't have any problems at all. And then down to St. Louis, New Orleans, and then back home. So that was the return party. So that leaves the permanent party numbering 33. The oldest member, Toussaint Charbonneau, the father of the youngest member, little Jean Baptiste, who's only 2 months old at this point. So they start working their way up the Missouri through the breaks here. This is where they start running into all the wildlife. The buffalo and the bison, rather, are so prolific. Lewis is walking along. Lewis is always ahead of the boats, and Lewis is walking along, and a bison is walking next to him like a dog for a whole day, just kind of hanging out with him, like he's scratching him on the head. You ever walk next to a bison? Their hump's like 6 foot tall, and this bison just kind of, hey, where are you guys going? Haven't seen you around here before. And it's just amazing, and the game is so plentiful, and so. Again, the keelboat is gone. So what they've done is they've built 6 more dugouts out of cottonwood logs. You know what? I don't bring the big dugouts. It's too hard to pass around. So there's just a little model of a dugout that they would have carried or taken with them, about 25 to 30 feet long. 6 of those, plus the 2 pirogues, are still in use. So that's how they head out from their winter camp here of 1804 and 5, and now they're going up the Missouri. And Lewis writes, he says, scenes of visionary enchantment fill my eyes. If you've ever seen the white cliffs of the Missouri, the upper Missouri, Lewis says it looks like European castles with gargoyles and kind of like what we have here in the Southwest with hoodoos, things like Bryce Canyon, those kind of eroded geologic features. So they're working their way along here. Now, the thing to keep in mind is Lewis is always out in the lead with usually the Field brothers, Reuben and Joseph, and also John Coulter and George Juillard. They're the 4 big-time hunters. So they're always ahead of the group, popping game, dressing it out, hanging it in a tree. So when the rest of the guys come up, it's there and they can just keep moving. Again, still doing 10 miles an hour going against the current. And they get up here to a river confluence because they've done a lot of talking with people here. And they said, well, how do we know we're on the right track? And they said, well, when you come to a big waterfall, you're on the right track. This is like country mile directions. You live in a rural area, you know how that goes. Or you go up to Bowie or Somerset. Well, there is a gas station there burned down in 47, but that's where you want to turn left. There's a little dirt track goes off, and you go up that a little ways, you see a big rock and turn right there. And if you're not looking for it, you're never going to get there. So that's kind of the way these directions were. It's coming. And so they failed to mention that this big river comes in from the northwest called the Marias River. Comes off of the eastern front of the Canadian Rockies and drains into the Missouri, right here up in Montana, around Browning, Montana. And so the Indians failed to tell them about that. So Lewis and his men, they get up here to this point and they're going, no, wait a minute. Nobody told us about this river coming in from the right. Haven't seen any waterfalls. Anybody seen any waterfalls? Nope. So they said, well, all the men, then Clark finally catches up with the other boats and the captains are sitting there going, well, it's coming in from the northwest. And all the men are going, yeah, we're looking for the Northwest Passage. And this river's coming in from the northwest, so we should go northwest. Every man said we should go northwest. They camped there for a week. The captains reconnoitered up the Marias River, and they also went further upstream on the Missouri. And now, if you were going to reconnoiter a river to see if this is the one you want to take, how far would you walk up that river? You know, if you're out hunting, oh, well, maybe I'll go that way, 5 miles. Most people say, yeah, like between 1 and 5 is the average. They went 30 miles. Just for a little walk, like, well, let's walk 30 miles and see what we find. Okay, how many have done a 30-mile backpack? You know, these guys did this just routine, you know. So when they got up there and they came back to their camp at the confluence of those two rivers, the captains decided that's not the way to go because it was too murky. It wasn't clear, like it's coming from, you know, a closer source to the snowmelt of the Rockies. But all the men said, we think this is it. The captain said, we think not. And so it was 31-2 decision. And when the captain said, no, we're not going that way, the men said, okay, you're the captains, we'll follow. That shows you their leadership skills and how well they work together. And the captains were correct. Had they gone up the Marias River, they would have spent a miserable winter in Western Canada and probably died there. Okay, so then Lewis again, he's always out ahead. Clark's back on the boats with his compass and his charts and filling in the map. And then Lewis sees the spray of a waterfall. And he is just over the moon. And because they said, when you find this waterfall, you're on the right track. So Lewis gets there. And now this is, how many of you have been to Great Falls, Montana? All right. Great Falls is the Great Falls of the Missouri River and from the headwaters from the Rockies. And so they get there and Lewis says, well, here's the waterfall. And then he walks a little bit and he goes, oh, there's another waterfall. Another waterfall. 5 waterfalls over 18 miles from the first one to the last one. 500-foot elevation gain and really rough terrain, all scablands and cactus. And Lewis goes, wow. He was mortified because they said, when you get to this waterfall, it'll take you guys a day to pass it. Well, that's if you're one person, you know, not, 33 people with 18,000 pounds of gear. And so Clark catches up and Lewis says, I've already started surveying a portage route because they're both trained as surveyors. So they survey this portage route. You can walk it today right through Great Falls, Montana. And there's bison everywhere. There's also these most terrible gentlemen because the bison are, they drown in the river and then their bodies bloat and float and then the bears come in. And they camped on a place called White Bear Island because the old grizzlies would have, they call them silver tips because when they got old, the tips of their fur would be white. And that's why, how many of you like Pinot Grigio? What color is it? It's silvery white, right? Pinot Noir is dark, right? So gris, Pinot Gris is silver or white. So grizzly is the French word for white, for an old silvery white look. And so they saw all these bears there. They had a lot of run-ins with the bears. That one picture I showed you yesterday had a little woodblock print of one of the men being treed by a bear, and he sat there all night, because grizzlies supposedly can't climb trees. They just push it over, and then they eat you, okay? And so they get up there to the falls. They portage. It's going to take them almost 3 weeks, and not one day. So again, Lewis especially is mortified. Clark just kind of sets to it. He's the real practical, where the moccasin meets the road kind of guy. And so Lewis now says, you know what? They leave the 2 Perot's behind, one at the base of Great Falls and one at the mouth of the Marias River. And the red Perot they leave at the mouth of Marias, covered up with brush and load it down with rocks. They're going to come back and get it on their way back and use it to go down the Missouri on their return trip. So they leave the 2 Perot's, and now they just drag in these dugouts, and they're dragging them up over an 18-mile, 500-foot elevation gain portage. These are dugout canoes that weigh about 2,000 pounds apiece. Now here's our Patrick Gass. I love this guy. He's the carpenter, right? He's the one that replaced Floyd when he died of burst appendix. And so he gets his box of carpenter's tools, because they had a whole box of carpenter's tools, leatherworking tools, gunsmithing tools, blacksmith tools, portable forge, hammers, tongs, and all the material they needed to fix things. It's not like, hey, run down to the corner store and pick me up some cold rolled steel so I can fix this. They had to take all the material with them. I mean, it's just phenomenal when you start thinking, you're putting all these things together of how they function on a daily basis. And so Patrick Ness gets out his big whipsaw and on this cottonwood tree, and he cuts off 4 wheels. And he leave it in the journals, 22.5 inches in diameter. Split rims, 8-bolt pattern. No, I'm just kidding. He just cut out these big wheels. And he got a big auger and he drilled a hole through it. He took the mast off one of the pros and he made it into an axle. So he made a 4-wheeled dugout canoe trailer. While he's doing that, a couple of other guys are making leather harnesses for the men, just like harness for an animal. They're making chest and shoulder harnesses for the guys. And then they start, they hook them all up to that and up over the portage route they go. This is July of 1805. It is sweltering hot. And a tremendous hailstorm comes in and drops hailstones the size of pigeon eggs. The men are sunburned, and now they're getting pelted with these large hailstones, and they are bruised and bloodied, and there's no cover. If you've been to Great Falls, it's the Great Plains. There ain't no trees there to get under shelter. And also the tall grass, what does it hide? Prickly pear cactus. So as if you've been to the Great Falls Museum, they have a life-size diorama. Anybody seen that one at the Lewis and Clark Trail Foundation? You haven't been there, Rainey. I don't think. And it's a big steep incline with the dugout canoe, and the men are all leaning at an angle about like this, pulling this dugout up this slope. And, I mean, it makes you tired just looking at this diorama, life-size diorama. And so Patrick Gass sees their distress. So he takes another piece of the mast, sets it in the pro, rigs a canvas on it because the wind was blowing up the coulee there. And so the wind caught the sail, and he says, we are truly sailing on dry land. And the wind caught the sail on the trailer of the dugout and helped him boost it up the way there. So they get to the top, and when they get up there, they realize we can't take all this gear. They've already had to cache a lot of stuff because they don't have the 2 pirogues. So they're leaving stuff behind, but they're thinking, but we still need this and this and this. There's not enough room for the men and what equipment they still have pared down to in those 6 dugouts. So Lewis says, don't worry, guys. And this is why he spent so much time at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, is this one. It's in here. Lewis had the armorers, the blacksmiths at Harper's Ferry, build an iron boat frame, 40 feet long, 4 feet wide, 2.5 feet tall. And I'll pass this picture around. And it was a forged out ribs, gunnels, keel, spreader bars, all forged out of iron. This was all put together with nuts and bolts at the junctions and then strengthened with wood pieces across. And then they put this thing together. And then Lewis, what they were going to do is put what they call Russia sheeting, which was an oiled and beeswax canvas over it, but they had used all that for their tents. So they didn't have any Russia sheeting left. Those old heavy tarps you remember from when you were a kid. And so Lewis says, well, he gets out his tape measure, he measures this thing out, and he calls his best hunters in, and he says, boys, you need to go hunting. He said, what do you need, Captain? He says, I need about 28 elk. Excuse me? Yeah, 28 elk, and we'll jerk the hides off them and use them to cover the boat, make a skin boat. George Drouillard's personal record for elk hunting was 11 in one day. So, 28 for 4, that's doable. So they go out and get their 28 elk, take all the hides off, use the meat, all the choice cuts, and then invert this thing and start sewing together this crazy quilt of hides. It's still short, doesn't come all the way to gunnels. Lewis looks again and measures and goes, George, I need 4 bison. I was just at the store. So George, they go out and they have 4 bison and they drag them in and finish off this thing. And now here's the most, probably Lewis at his all-time low on the expedition. They've got 30 tons of gear that he has procured for this expedition. It's been going really well. He forgot one thing because he thought when he was going to put this boat together that he would seal the seams with tar. And he forgot the tar because he thought, well, we're going to be out west there. I'll just use pine pitch. No pine trees at Great Falls. It's the Great Plains. So there is no pitch and he has no tar. So here's these seams as these raw hides are drying out and the sewing holes are getting bigger. Lewis is mortified. So they render down the elk tallow and they throw in some beeswax, a little bit of powdered charcoal to give it a binder, and they smear this glop all over this thing, inside and out, over all the seams to seal it up. And Lewis is like, well, this has taken 2 weeks of time, of a lot of labor. And people said, well, what's William Clark doing? Well, about 1 week into it, Clark walked by and just went, Hey, you guys follow me in pictures axes. And he went and picked out some more trees for more dugouts because he looked at it and thought, this isn't going to fly, or it's not going to float. And so, but he didn't say anything. And so they get the boat, they invert it, they put it in the water, and Lewis said, my experiment, she floated like a perfect cork. And he was pleased as punch. So he commanded all the men, get inside. So they had, other guys were making paddles. So he says, step right in the middle. So they're very gingerly, they're getting in. Okay, good. Right, everybody, let's do a little forward stroke. And Lewis said, she responded to our every movement. It's like, okay, this is going to work. And then the next journal entry, a violent wind arose. And things are moving around, and some guys are back paddling, some guys are forward paddling, some guys are digging, and all of a sudden the boat is flexing. And that cold water hitting the grease on those seams. What happens when grease and cold water come together? The grease gets very brittle. And almost instantaneously, all the grease just went off the seams. Water started shooting through all the sewing holes like a 40-foot colander. And the men are they're just going down. It's just sinking. And Captain Lewis was mortified. That's your part. Captain Lewis was mortified. Gotta make sure you're still with me. Don't make me throw the tomahawk. We gotta catch it. Oh, we gotta go. Well, we'll do some more tomorrow. But anyway, y'all good? Is everybody good? All right, I'll get you to this one point because I need some audience participation. So Lewis says to his men, scuttle the experiment. And John Ordway says, sure, she's scuttling herself. So the experiment sinks, Lewis is mortified, but Clark has already built more dugouts. And at this point, they keep dragging their boats up the river, and it just is getting harder and harder and harder. And we'll get them to, I think I probably need to stop there and start with, is everybody good for can I go a few more minutes? It's just when it's 2 years, 4 months, and 10 days, and they say, can you do this in 45? It's like, no. Okay, so they get up to the top of Great Falls. The canoe, the dugout, the iron boat rather, is cached. They just leave it there. It's still kind of the holy grail of the expedition. People are still looking for it with ground penetrating radar. They haven't found it yet, but they're hoping to find it. So then they go through a place called the Gates of the Mountains, where the mountain ranges come like this, and the river snakes through there, and it looks like a box canyon. And they get through that, and then their next big stop is going to be right here at Three Forks, Montana. Some of you have probably been to Three Forks, Montana. It's about the size of Somerset. Okay, but it's got a grand old railroad hotel there from the days of Yellowstone National Park. So it's a really cool little town. And they got there to Three Forks, Montana. And it's here where it's the Three Forks of the Upper Missouri. This is the Jefferson, the Madison, and the Gallatin rivers come together to form the Missouri River proper. And so they got to camp again there. And it's here at that location that as they're reconnoitering and going up each of these three branches of the Three Forks to figure out, ascertain which is the correct one, they look over and here's Sacagawea bouncing on her toes, sucking on 2 fingers. And she's obviously excited. And they're going, well, what's that about? And so they kind of through translation and sign language, she says, I've been here as a child. I was nursed here. We would come here to gather berries and to hunt. They said, oh, so you've been here? Yeah, I've been here. And it's probably this very similar, very close area to where she was kidnapped from when she was just 8 or 9 years old and taken from Three Forks, Montana, right here to Mandan, North Dakota. So, and when she started her life as basically a slave. So the captains are encouraged. She recognizes the area. Long story short, the captains again ascertained the correct river. We're going to name it the Jefferson, the author of our enterprise. So we're going to take that fork That's going to fed in by the Bighorn and another smaller tributary, and they follow that. And now they're just dragging their canoes through it's like an irrigation ditch. You know, I mean, it's just this little narrow. They're walking more than they're not paddling. They're just dragging the boats. And now they're desperately seeking the Shoshones. They've got to find the Shoshones because it's obvious that this is no longer a river trip. They are just dragging their boats through a muddy trough. And so they said, you know, so the captains break up. I'm going to shorten it up here just because there's too much detail. But they shorten it up and they spread out. And then they said, we got to find these Shoshones. And they keep seeing fleeting, like one horseman over here, another horseman over there. But as soon as that horseman sees them, he kicks his horse and takes off. Lewis finally stumbles upon 3 women, an old woman, she was probably 40, and 2 younger gals. And they're out there and they got their hats off and they're picking berries. And Lewis and his men got the drop on them. And the old woman saw them coming. She dropped her basket of berries. She thought, well, we're gone. Because Sacagawea had told Lewis, when you see my people, roll up your sleeve. This is, you know, through translation, of course, she spoke no English, Sacagawea. Tap on your arm and say, tababon, tababon. That means a white person. Well, Lewis got the accent on the wrong syllable. Instead of saying tababon, he said tababon, tababon, which means a white person, but like a corpse, like a dead person. So he's going, tababon, tababon, and the woman's going, oh God, you know, we're into the Lewis and Clark zombie expedition, you know? And so she just drops to her knees and thinks, I'm going to die right here. But one of the young girls that was with her, she took off running. And she went back to the village and said, there's these zombie people. And they've got, you know, my sister and my auntie, you know, and they're probably going to kill them. So all the warriors come riding up, mounted on their beautiful horses. And the captain's like, whoa, 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 hold on. And Lewis had already given her a mirror, some beads, a little bit of vermilion for her cheeks. And so when all the rest of the camp came, she said, no, 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 they're not hurting. Look, they gave me presents. They're nice. And so not only did they find a group of Shoshones, they found Sacagawea's band, the Agaduka Shoshones, the salmon eaters. Now you talk about a needle in a continental haystack. This is phenomenal. And so the captains are reunited. They're now camping with the Shoshones. They will call this place Camp Fortunate. And because they were fortunate enough to find the Shoshones. At this stage of the game, though, they need to trade for horses. So I need 4 volunteers, and we'll end up with this. Thank you very much, Laura Lee. I appreciate your quick response. Her hand went up so fast, she didn't even see it herself. Yeah, I need, you're going to be Sacagawea. And I need 3 men. 3, Dave, you, Seth, come on up here. Okay, so Dave, you strike me as a William Clark kind of guy. So you just have to read that, okay? Not yet, but just say your lines. And this is my son, Seth. And yeah, you can give him more of a hand than that. I'm going to have Seth play Charbonneau. No, I'm going to have you play Francois Lepage. The French, so just read that phonetically, just the way it sounds. Okay, and then you're going to be Charbonneau because I just looked at you and I said, there's a guy that if he knows Hidatsa, then he's got to know. So Charbonneau is going to be this, what's your name? Nick is going to be Charbonneau. And so you're going to read this in Hidatsa. And of course, Sacagawea is going to read her part. Okay, so here's the deal. This is, remember, Sacagawea speaks no English. And now she's with her people, so she still speaks her native language. She speaks some Hidatsa, which she learned, and her husband has also lived many years among the Hidatsa. So he knows French and Hidatsa. Sacagawea basically only knows a little smattering of Hidatsa and her native tongue of Shoshone. William Clark, he doesn't speak any French or nothing. He's an all-American boy here. So what they're wanting to do is trade for horses. That's a simple translation to get from A to B. So he's going to ask for that. And then Francois Lepage, he speaks English and French. So he's going to translate the English to the French. The French is going to be translated to Charbonneau here, because he understands French, and he's going to translate it into Hidatsa, which Sacagawea will then translate from Hidatsa into Shoshone. I will play the chief of the Shoshones down here at the end of the line. So again, just read it phonetically, starting with Dave, and just say it out loud to everybody at the back of the room.
We want to trade for horses.
Nous voulons troquer quelque chose pour des chevaux.
Nima, Adama, Ihu, Hakes, Shaha, Mashu, Bashu, Ella, Magu, Barry, Maha, Waha.
Well done. Well done. Okay, now here's the Hidatsa to Shoshone.
Dumagi mana gwa mi yadu abud biaba ogweda.
So all this to say, we want to trade for horses. So she says that to the chief, Kamehameha, and Kamehameha says, "Do you want to trade for horses?" No, no horses. So they do it again and again. And we're going to have you do it again and again, but they do it again. And finally, on about the second or third go, Sacagawea looks, and because she's just this young girl, and here's the chief of the Shoshones. So she's not walking up to him going like, "Hey, how's it going?" She's like, "Oh, I'm with these guys," and so she's a little nervous. But after she loosens up a little bit, they connect with their eyes, and she looks at him, and he looks at her. And they recognize each other as brother and sister. He thought she was dead because the last he saw her, she was being carried off, kidnapped from Three Forks where their parents were killed and numerous other members of the tribe were killed. And so now Sacagawea is reunited with her family, her brother, and she embraced. They tried to keep a 6-foot distance, but it didn't work. And they all got COVID and died. No, and so they reunite. And then at that point, Kamehameha says, "Since you brought our sister, our daughter back to us, we will trade for horses." And so they give Lewis and Clark the 30-some horses that they need. And then people always say, "Well, didn't she want to stay with her people?" No, they were dirt poor. They were starving to death. And she could see that. With the captains and the expedition, she knew her son was well taken care of. She was safe. And she said, "No, I'm staying with these guys." And so that's how they got their horses. That's where Sacagawea really came into her own by providing that link of information to acquire the horses for the Core Discovery. We'll end it there and we'll finish it up the next time. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. And if anybody's interested, we do have DVDs up here. We recorded this. It's the last 2 hours and 15 minutes. We'll do the Pacific. We'll get into the Pacific tomorrow because it's just over the mountains and to the beach. But we do have a DVD that's available. It's 2 hours and 15 minutes. It covers 4 chapters, basically what I'm doing here. And I'm proud to say I've been selling for years. It's a million seller. Pretty cool. I have 1 million of them in my cellar, so help me out. I gotta get rid of these things. Okay? Thank you very much. Thank you.
So what is the title of your book?
It's called Bound for the Western Sea. And all the copies here are sold, but more are supposed to come tomorrow.
Oh, okay.
So hopefully we'll have some by the end of the week to sell.
Okay.
Yeah,
Is it available online?
it is. Yeah, it's there's a Kindle of it too, but you get it through Amazon.
Okay.
And the really cool thing now is that I have this partnership in New York that's going to make a deal. So yeah, we'll see, you know. Yeah, it's pretty exciting. And Todd read it for historical actors. So that's how I got to know him. Yeah, great. So is there a particular interest in history?
We'll be home.
Wonderful. Yeah, this is but it's from the dog. And so that, you know, my so I had Milo Todd, who lives with that. He loved it. So, yeah, oh, that's great. Yeah, I should have some.
Yeah.
You know, yes, well, good. Wonderful. He's urging me on.